get started. Well, my brother, welcome to CWS as it is for the first time, I should say. How are you?
Thank you, and good night to you, Selvin. Thank you very much for hosting me on the program.
Good night. You know, Nigel, it's the first time that I've had the privilege to interview a husband and wife who are both committed to changing Guyana. And so I don't take this lightly. I'm very honored, actually. You know, Kathy mentioned early on that you were always reluctant to participate in politics. And I added my piece that it was not for the lack of trying. In our early days when I used to visit Guyana back in the late 80s and early 90s, you were very, very reluctant. So I am glad that circumstances and Kathy, I guess it took a woman that got you to participate, to be so involved. So thanks for that.
Thank you. You're probably more correct than you think. Yes, I did follow my wife into this venture.
Well, Nigel, I want to jump right into it. Why a coalition, and why do you believe, or what do you believe believe the AFC and APNU? Well, let me put it this way. What do you think these two parties have learned from the last election that they believe a coalition is appropriate now?
So a lot of things have happened since the last election, and I'd like to say there were a lot of lessons that we have learned since the last election. And I think a big component of my response to your question is going to involve the behavior of the government since the last election. Mm-hmm. As you know, since the last election, it was the first time the country had results which did not indicate that there was a majority leader. I think the population spoke very clearly that they were of the view that the way forward for the country was one of consensus. I think the government, by its consistent and persistent actions, indicated that they were not interested in consensus. And if you've been following the political developments in Guyana right up to the end of the last parliament and just up to the time of prorogation of the parliament, you will know that the Alliance for Change at every step of the way opened the door, kept the door open to the president. Just before the no confidence motion, we wrote to the president, we said to him, the country is sliding into crisis. Here are 10 critical areas that we think you should address. The president's response at the time was that, you know, go on, make my day, bring it on, and words that indicated that he was more concerned in protecting his image rather than taking the country forward. In terms of the actual coalition, I know there have been statements that were made by leaders of my party that indicated that the coalition at various times in our history was just not going to be on for various reasons. But I think the straw that finally broke the camel's back, I think, was the fact that this was a government that indicated by its actions that it was no longer prepared to abide by the Constitution. It wasn't prepared to abide by the rule of law. And the final declaration by the Chief Justice in the judicial proceedings in which he said that the spending of the $4.5 billion by the government when Parliament had clearly indicated that they could not go ahead and spend in that fashion was unconstitutional. The response from the Cabinet Secretary and head of the Presidential Secretariat, Dr. Luncheon, was they would do it again. So there comes a time in the history of a country where if the government, by its actions and by its expressions of intent and its declared motives, indicates that the constitution of the country is not sufficiently important for them to have to adhere to its most basic tenets, then all citizens have to get together. And as you know, the president's response was to prorogue Parliament. In other words, he suspended Parliament. And our initial reaction to that, the very first reaction, was that this was not a party political issue. This was an issue for the entire country. And we decided that we were going to engage all political and non-political actors, including civil society, in an anti-prorogation move because it was the most undemocratic thing that can happen. And arising out of that engagement, of course, the major opposition party was involved, and we had the first meeting that took place at the Spirit of the Revolution. But it was out of our concern about where the present minority government was taking this country in violation of the principles of the Constitution, in violation of all efforts at attempting to mediate and to a conciliatory approach, that we decided the time had come when all progressive, right-thinking, democratic forces in the country needed to get together to protect Guyana in effect from itself.
Nigel, what is your greatest hope for this coalition, apart from winning? What do you hope will happen after this?
That's a relatively easy question for me to answer at a personal level. At a personal level, my principal involvement in politics at this stage is to effect constitutional change. I have a big difficulty with the Constitution that vests the sort of power it does in the president. This is not only the fact that he's immune from suit, but the fact that all executive power is vested in the president, and that you identify the president of a multiracial, multicultural country based on the person that gets the plurality of the votes and not necessarily the majority of the votes. I think it's offensive to democratic thinking. I think it is anti-developmental. It allows for the abuses that we have seen since independence. It allows for the abuses that we've seen since the new constitution in 1980 was promulgated and amended in 2003. And to me, one of the principal concerns of the new APNU-AFC alliance should be addressing the constitutional issue. Because for me, it's not a question of whether you get a good candidate, as David Grange no doubt is. The question is, whoever we ever put as a candidate, whoever we ever elect as a candidate, should never be in the position which they can abuse the powers, as we have witnessed for as long as we have witnessed in the country, of president. And they certainly should not enjoy immunity from accountability, immunity from suit, immunity from being responsible for their actions from the courts or any other appropriate judicial body.
Nigel,
I think that's number one. Certainly there are a series of economic and developmental issues. Education, personally, I think should be the top of the agenda. Clearly one of the reasons why we're feeling as a country, why we're not competitive as a country, why we have not been able after decades to realize 1/4 of the potential that we have, is because our educational system has just not been producing at a general level. I'm not talking about the outstanding students, because they'll do well anywhere. At a general level, we haven't been able to provide an adequately educated population to begin to take us from primary producers of primary products to rather sophisticated, intellectual-based property producing economy, the sort of modern technological-based economy which allows us to exploit our natural resources at all levels, not just primary, secondary, and tertiary levels, and to develop the country. We have less than 1 million people to manage.
Nigel, having been in the trenches for some time, what should the coalition be mindful of to survive and be successful on May 11th? What are some things?
You mean in terms of the campaign or after the election?
No, in terms of the campaign. We need them to survive the campaign. We need them to go into the May 11th elections as a whole unit, wholesome unit. And then, yeah, perhaps after the elections, what should they be mindful of? Because this could not have been easy putting together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at the indicators of the principal competitor, which is the governing party, the People's Progressive Party, Civic, thereby their actions, I think, will certainly impact a lot on what we do. We have a very positive program that we believe will take the country forward. I think the People's Progressive Party have indicated by their areas of concentration that they want to make this a personalized campaign. They have been attacking Mr. Nagamootoo and Mr. Ramchitan relentlessly. They have indicated by their actions that they're primarily concerned with their voter base in regions 5 and 6, which means that they really are not that concerned about campaigning or getting votes anywhere else outside of those principal regions, which unfortunately sends a message of a rather biased campaign program. I think as we get closer to the elections, you will certainly experience a shrill in the level and hysteria that seems to be dominating the People's Progressive Party's campaign at the moment. And I think the personal attacks, particularly in Mr. Nagamootoo and Mr. Ramchachan, are going to get more vicious. They're going to become a lot more personalized, and I dare say the level of general campaigning is probably going to be lowered by that. So if in a word, in response to your question, my response is simply that I think, unfortunately, the campaign is going to get pretty nasty. I am convinced that the Alliance APNU campaign will always occupy the high grounds, and we will certainly not be responding to them at that level, but I think it needs to be recognized for what it is. And certainly access to the media is going to be an issue.
Nigel, given the current atmosphere in Guyana, can you envision a scenario whereby if the coalition wins and establishes the next government, it will ask and encourage more women, regardless of race, to be part of it?
Oh, that's a fact. I mean, I have no doubt that the coalition, we acknowledge that critical to our development is participation by the women. That's not an issue. We've lost some excellent fighters along the way, very, very painful. We lost Ms. Baca in the last year. I mean, there have been people who we've lost, but I have no doubt that the participation in government by women is going to exceed the statutory minimum, which is 30%, without a doubt, at all levels, I would say.
What do you believe would surprise us to know about the coalition? What do you believe would surprise many of us?
Be surprised to know about the coalition?
Yeah, you're on the inside. You have some privileged, I guess, knowledge about the various players and so on. What do you think would surprise many of us in the diaspora to know about the coalition?
Well, I don't know, Selwyn, if you're inviting me to breach the confidences of the discussion.
No, but Nigel, I know that you're an astute attorney and you have ways and means of delivering a message without divulging, proprietary information. So give it your best shot.
Well, let me make this clear. I don't wish to divulge any information. I can tangentially or accidentally that I shouldn't. I am not a member of the Joint Party Campaign Committee, which is essentially running the campaign, and therefore, insofar as the divulgence of information which might surprise the general public is concerned, and I'm not trying to evade your question, I'm not in a position to really provide anything that's not already.
Let's try this one, which I asked Kathy a moment ago. What do you know personally about David Granger and Moses Nagamootoo that encourage you to throw your full support behind this coalition?
Let me say this, and I say this with great respect and deference to both gentlemen. I don't think my support for the coalition was necessarily hinged on the character of either Mr. Granger or Mr. Nagamootoo, both of whom I think are excellent candidates. I think it's really the principle and the commitment to moving Guyana forward in a unified manner, which allows and affords equitable distribution to all citizens, so that we all are afforded an opportunity or equal opportunity to participate. And it's the commitment of the parties to that principle. So Mr. Granger is an excellent citizen. I think he has a great record. His reputation is beyond challenge, enjoys an excellent reputation, as does Mr. Nagamootoo. You couldn't ask for a better experienced political figure than Mr. Nagamootoo. But to me, the principal issue here is whether the parties that are in this coalition are committed to a unified Guyana. They're committed to constitutional reform. They're committed to equal opportunity to all the citizens of this country, irrespective of their geographic location, their cultural, ethnic location. I think that's the principle that attracted me to it. And that's the principle which I intend to hold the leaders to. It wasn't necessarily the fact that it was Mr. David Granger or it was Mr. Nagamootoo. It was whether the parties, through their leaders, were committed to that principle.
What can we in the diaspora do to foster voter turnout?
The first and easiest thing that, and I dare say the contribution that we most appreciate from the diaspora, is the influence they have through their constant communication with their family members who are still in Guyana, to persuade them to go out and vote for the coalition. But more importantly, far more importantly, excuse me,
Bless you.
than who they go to vote for, is the question of the fact that they go to vote. I think it's important that members of the diaspora encourage and implore all members of their family who are eligible, who are on the list to vote, go out there and vote. You need to exercise that franchise. It's too critical a moment in the history of the country not to exercise your franchise.
The last time you appeared on CWS, you mentioned, you gave us a list of perhaps 5 principles you would like to see implemented in Guyana. That could really help to grow, to transform and grow the country. What 3 do you believe are critical to the long-term growth of Guyana? For those of us who might be tuned in today and may not have heard of them, what 3 principles?
Age is a terrible thing, but I believe I'm going to be consistent here. For me, initially, the 3 areas that I would, and not necessarily in order of priority, that I would like the government to immediately, or the new government as it takes over on May 12th, to immediately spend and concentrate a lot of time and effort on. They are constitutional reform, education, and identifying a national, or updating the national development strategy so that it has a 15 to 20-year vision of the future of the country and the implementation of the principles of that national development strategy once it's agreed by the principal political players involved.
Let me just shift into the chat room for a second. Brenda Richards, hello Nigel, good to see you back in fine form. Nicholas McDavid, as the PPP has a significant part of Guyana's history and always will, I must here say I am not a PPP supporter, but inclusive government is necessary for progress. Nicholas again, the AFC APNU must break the PPP stronghold and with the grace of God take control of government, but it should then offer concessions to the PPP for an all-inclusive government. Your thoughts on that, Nigel?
I think both of the leaders of the alliance, both Mr. Granger and Mr. Nagamutu, have made it very clear that after they win the elections in May the 12th, they will include those progressive elements of the People's Progressive Party for commitment to the country. I think Mr. Granger's exact words were that you cannot ignore 48% of the population. So I think that commitment is already there from both leaders. Both Nagamutu and Mr. Granger have indicated that when they win, they will include progressive members of the People's Progressive Party in the new government.
Brenda Richards, I know there has been discussion about a coalition for some time, so many of us are pleased to see that this vision has come to fruition to effectuate positive change in Guyana. Nigel, today being International Women's Day, do you have a particular message for the women of Guyana?
I actually posted my message on Facebook. I can't quote it word for word, but in essence, I was attempting to indicate and offer an apology as a man for being part of that segment of society who for so long, either by our silence or by our active participation in the assumptions that the society had that women were not equal to men, that caused us to lose so many of our sisterhood along the way. And that I believe that we've reached a stage now where we're beginning, and I say this very, very cautiously, that the male population, certainly in Guyana, is beginning to appreciate how much we've contributed to the devastation that has been inflicted upon our sisters for so long. And therefore, it is incumbent on us as we move forward, not only that we ensure that system is reversed, but that we ensure that all the opportunities and the aspirations that our mothers and our sisters and daughters had are actually realized in this society, so that they have an equal opportunity to realize their gain just as much as the men have enjoyed for centuries. But the full text of my message is up on my Facebook page.
Nigel, you know, I have a tendency to put you on the spot, my brother, and I hope by asking this question, I'm not really actually doing this, but should this coalition succeed in becoming the next government, and if you're asked, what position would you like? What portfolio would you like?
That's relatively easy to say, and I'm afraid my response is probably going to disappoint you. My commitment to the struggle for a different day in Guyana is a commitment to constitutional change. That's my principal commitment. I am not interested in a ministerial portfolio. I am not interested in a high-profile portfolio. When the constitution is changed, I may reconsider my position. But as presently advised, that is not something that is on my position right now. I'm afraid I'd be very gracious. It would graciously have to decline, unless, of course, there was some immediate constitutional change. Not commitment. I'd actually like to see the constitution change so that all of our citizens know that we are not going to live under the existing constitution.
What is a new government, especially by this coalition, means for all Guyanese, and especially the indigenous people?
Well, for all Guyanese, and particularly the indigenous, I've been privileged enough to have developed quite a significant relationship with the indigenous community over the last 5 to 10 years. I think the indigenous community, they would like a relationship with central government in which all of their concerns are treated with as an equal. Not people from the coast going and giving them a couple of tractors and a couple $1,000s every time their vote becomes relevant. They have real concerns about land. They have real concerns about their traditional lands. They have real concerns about real development. In other words, building capacity in their communities. It always upsets several of us every time we visit an indigenous community. The schools that are being built are built by people outside of their communities. The roads that are built in the community, if they are any roads, are built by people outside of the community. And when those contractors leave, nobody from that community has developed the capacity to be able to do the things that the outsiders came in to do. So there's not even an education, information, skills transfer that occurs. So in other words, they're treated as if they should remain in this, what they call pristine condition for the entertainment of other people without giving them the real tools to develop themselves and determine their own development agenda. So in short, for the indigenous people, I believe they would like to write their own agenda. They would like to chart their own course rather than have it imposed upon them. And I think the new government offers them real hope of that.
In the chat room, Nicholas McDavid, on the subject of International Women's Day, I salute the women, I salute the women of the Caribbean. I salute the women of Guyana. Women are and have always been the building blocks of society. Guyana is a place where women need to be liberated. Guyanese women are one of the most powerless in comparison to other places in the region. We need to mobilize and revolutionize Guyanese women. Brenda Richards, question continued. Does this present any level of pressure on the coalition to promote more women in your party to more pivotal positions?
No, I don't think the APNU would have any difficulty with promoting more women. I think historically, politically, two of the prominent constituent members of the APNU, both the People's National Congress and the Working People's Alliance, have been at the forefront historically of the advancement of women. So I don't think there's any potential for fracture there at all. I think it's a good thing that the progressive thinkers certainly have women's issues that have been there historically, and I believe continue to be there. So I don't see that as an area for potential difficulties.
Nigel, when you think about women's issues, you just gave a very eloquent description of your message for women on International Women's Day. But when you think about women's issues, what one particular issue is always foremost in your mind?
In Guyana? you're talking about?
Yes, in Guyana, sorry.
Yeah, sure. In Guyana, the number one issue, first of all, would have to be domestic violence and how we treat it and the causes of domestic violence. A lot of those are born of the economic disparity between men and women, the fact that men are unable to deal with the role of the new woman, given the fact that he's been indoctrinated in some pretty backward precepts and concepts of the role of women. But violence is clearly the immediate concern. I mean, if last year, I can't remember, it was some awful number of women that had been murdered in the year. I think we're heading to probably 30 or 40. Big problem. So I would say violence against women, but the problem with dealing with violence against women is that you first have to look and identify what the root causes of the violence are. And so in identifying that, I think certainly the economic disparity, the other social challenges that arise would be number one. The other issue too in Guyana is that, I believe that in terms of real participation in national decision making, whether in the private sector or in the public sector, women occupy a disproportionately small share and influence in that process. I mean, if you look at the private sector, I think at the moment we probably only have one female CEO of a major company. And that's in a country where I'm sure in terms of wage and unwaged labor and contribution, women play a far greater role than men. That speaks volumes on the private sector commission, for argument's sake. I'm not sure how many women we have there. But certainly in terms of participation at a governmental level, in terms of the ability to influence our policies, I can't think of too many significant people who are there who are necessarily advancing an agenda for women. So, in a word, the major issue is easy, which is domestic violence, but slightly more complex than that is identifying the causes of it, but at the same time, removing the obstacles, full female realization of their aspirations. I mean, we still, in several fields, have a disproportionate number of male representatives. I think if you look at the trade union movement, you can pick several areas in which there's either an absence or paucity of female representation.
Nicholas McDavid said again, I will answer Selwyn, Mr. Nigel Hughes, and I say this without reservation, should be appointed Attorney General. He's a man of high integrity and has fought for the rights of the everyday Guyanese. It would be silly for the Alliance not to appoint him so. I say this with the full weight of my name and all it has stood for politically in Guyana's history. Brenda Richards, Selwyn, the first part of my question was a follow-up to my question regarding the selection of prime ministerial candidate, which is under Nicholas' question. All right, let me look for that. Brenda, okay, I think I see it. Question continue. Does the present day, does this present any level of pressure on the coalition to promote more women in your... Brenda, is that the question? If you don't mind, please copy and paste it over for me. I'll ask Nigel a few questions in the meanwhile. Nigel, what does it mean or how does it feel? What is
you haven't actually asked the question, so forgive me for not responding.
I know that. Yeah, you got me back there. Okay, buddy. I have a visit scheduled for Guyana soon. Describe what it feels like to see your wife in the political sphere, so committed to political and social change in Guyana.
What does it feel like?
Yeah. What does it feel like?
I'm not sure. I wasn't home to hear her interview, but I'm sure she must have indicated to you that she was actually the reason I got involved in politics.
Yeah, she did.
I was not at all interested in getting involved in this, and she got involved since 2005 or something like that. I am, of course, naturally very, very proud of my wife. When she got involved, I was a little apprehensive about, you know, whether this is necessarily the best thing she wanted to do at this stage of her life, but of course it's her call. And as she said then, and she has said repeatedly since, you know, if we don't get involved to change the system, then we lose the right to criticize it. Very valid point. I am 100%, 120% behind my wife's involvement, and I will do whatever is necessary to support her, her commitment to the state. Her commitment far exceeds my commitment. And whatever is necessary that I can do to take Guyana forward and support her in the process, I will do that.
Nigel, she told us about the moment, the first time you got up and spoke at an event that she invited you to attend, and you wanted to speak, and she questioned you about doing so. Do you really want to do this? And you said, yes, I must, I have to. I don't know if you can remember the time, but what I would like to ask you is, what was going through your mind? What were you present to at that moment that made you decide there and then, I need to get up and speak?
It was, I remember that very clearly. It was the 24th of September 2011.
Oh God, this guy.
Yeah, it was my inaugural political presentation. It was done at Linden. I got up on that platform and spoke from my heart. Those of you who've seen the actual presentation will realize that was just speaking from my heart. I think by that time, it had become very evident. We were in the last days of the former president's reign. He had clearly demonstrated by his actions that, you know, not only did he, let me put it this way, he had put the people of this country in a dangerous collision course with themselves. He treated the country virtually as if it was his private property. There was such an inequitable distribution of the opportunities for economic advancement in the country. And at the time, it couldn't have been more than 3-4 weeks since I think the head of the Presidential Secretariat and Cabinet Secretary testified in that case between the president and the very famous journalist, Mr. Kissoon, that people of African descent were not qualified to represent the country. And coming from that cultural and ethnic grouping, I mean, how could I possibly say to any young person, a child or otherwise, that in a country in which my foreparents had contributed as much as any other person to the development of this country, that I could say to the next generation that they were not qualified. And it's a dangerous place when the head of state, through his representative, can feel confident enough to enter a witness box and say on the oath that part of the population, I don't care which part it is, if he had said the indigenous people weren't qualified, if he had said the Indian people weren't qualified, the Portuguese, the Chinese, it didn't matter which ethnic group it was. But the fact that the head of the Presidential Secretariat, speaking on behalf of the president in legal proceedings, felt confident enough to testify in a court of law under oath that some part of our population was not qualified to run this country was offensive at the highest possible level. And it either was that I had to migrate to that stage or I could no longer keep my peace. And I'm afraid at that stage I took the decision, I'm sorry, I can't stay in a country where you are condemning me and the next generation and the generation after that to some form of second-class citizenship, where our contribution to this country is equal to any other person, and say that we were not qualified. And that for me was the turning point for my involvement.
Nigel, as you travel around the country and give various speeches here and there, listening to the cries and the pleas and the comments and so on from the citizens, what is the general message you've been getting?
Well, the general message, I mean, certainly in the areas that I've gone to, that's not just Region 4, that's Region 9, that's Region 1, that's Region 2, indigenous communities, every community, is that people want change. That's the one chorus line that I think everybody is singing. We may be singing from different verses in terms of what we want to see change, but I think everybody in the society, without fail, thinks enough is enough, we want change. And if you think about it, in the last 50 years, Guyana has only changed administration once, in 1992. Now, how can you be a modern democratic state, and in the last 50 years, you've only changed government once? Yeah. Something has got to be wrong with the process if that happens. And the message, I think, across the board is changed.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, there was a very, I'm sorry to digress a little bit, you know, the Link show, which they have every year at the Cultural Center, which is a sort of satire and lampooning of all national figures. In one of the scenes, the Obio women, there are two Obio women who are invoking the spirit of Burnham at the request of President Ramatar. And so when they have invoked the spirit of Burnham, Burnham comes forward and Burnham says to Ramatar, "What is it that you want?" And Ramatar says, "Well, I want to win the election." And the response from Burnham is, "Well, you have to collate with the coalition." So, you know, I think that sums it up, and that's in a satirical lampoon type, you know, the Link show. I mean, even in the Link show, they recognize that, you know, there's really only one way forward for the country.
So I'm gonna shift into the chat room again. Ian G. Hall. I applaud the efforts of the local Guyanese and those in the APNU AFC coalition and their steadfastness for a unity government. I hope that this is a positive turning point for Guyana and Guyanese. What would be Nigel's approach to reforming law enforcement should the APNU AFC win the election?
Yeah, sure. Good question. I appreciate it, and I want you to appreciate here that my response here is going to be personal. I think the entire culture of the Guyana police force has to change. It's not just a question of paying policemen more money. The entire culture of the force requires a change. It requires a new approach to policing. It requires a new approach to the country. One of the most fundamental aspects of policing to make it successful, or I should say one of the most fundamental aspects of successful policing, is that the police force has to enjoy the confidence of the society in which they work. If you took a poll right now of the country, I believe 60 to 70% of the Guyana citizens will say they don't trust the Guyana police force. It's part of the reason why juries continue to bring back not guilty verdicts. It's simply because they cannot trust the word of the police. Now, you cannot have effective policing, crime solving, and a successful law enforcement regime if the principal persons who you're supposed to protect and serve don't have confidence in you. And part of the reason for this lack of confidence is the fact that the culture in the police force does not lend itself to confidence building measures, their capacity to investigate, their capacity to be objective, and most importantly, their capacity to be independent of political direction is almost non-existent. If you ask the average person whether they think the police force is subject to political direction or not, they will consistently say to you, yes, of course we think so. Now, how are you going to police a country in which the electorate is split down the middle on voting lines and racial lines and cultural lines, where everybody, irrespective of their race or culture, has no confidence in the force? So I think we need to change the culture. And changing the culture, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. This has happened in several other societies. What we need to do is to get the people who are experienced in causing cultural changes and operational changes in large organizations that causes them to rebuild confidence. Clearly, a lot of technological issues can be addressed. The investigative capacity of the Guyana Police Force is very, very limited. We've just spent close to $1 billion in a lab, yet we can't do testing of the police labs, training, the level of recruitment, the qualifications to get into the force, and of course, remuneration is important, but I don't think it's the only factor.
Nigel, this is Brenda's question. When the announcement was first made about this coalition, it generated a lot of excitement. Shortly thereafter, there was the announcement of the PPPC selection of a female PM candidate. Mm-hmm. Then followed. Does this present any level of pressure on the coalition to promote more women in their party to more pivotal positions. So that question that you answered before, I read this as a question, isolated question, but she's tying it in to the fact that the PPP elected a woman to be the next prime minister.
Yeah, you know, let me respond to that this way. I'm trying very, very strenuously here not to be disrespectful to their choice. Mm-hmm. The fact that the PPP has selected a woman in a political race, you have to analyze why it is that they selected a woman. I am personally unfamiliar with Ms. Harper's commitment to women's issues because I haven't. It's not that she might not have said something about it, but we have checked our records, and we have been able to find occasions in which she has advanced an opinion that has specifically addressed gender issues. The other criteria that people have raised in the public domain about her consideration is her ethnic cultural background. I have not found in her public statements or private statements, the ones that I have access to, any statement by Ms. Harper in which she has expressed any views on issues that impact segments of the community who she's supposed to represent. So if the PPP has selected this candidate on either of those bases, and when you look at the history of the candidate, and that history does not disclose the articulation of any position on the reasons they say that they have identified this candidate, then they must be for another reason. And so for us to respond in like form is like asking us to go identify somebody because of their sex, irrespective of their position on important issues such as women's rights or rights of people of African descent, and just put them up there. Because I think the most disturbing thing about Ms. Harper's appointment, and I think the greatest disservice they could have done to her as an individual candidate, was to put her up, and on the day that they announced her appointment as prime minister candidate, she was present, and to have two men speak about her. And every other occasion that statements have been attributed to her, they have been attributed to her by men. Now, with the greatest respect, I think it's disrespectful to women to have somebody up there ostensibly as a representative of women and not be allowed to speak in her own on her own behalf. Mm-hmm. In relation to the second part of your question, where the alliance identifies a candidate, that candidate is going to be, first of all, assessed on their capacity, their ability, their integrity. And we have more than an adequate supply of women who fill that criteria. Probably have more women than men that fill that criteria. Therefore, when we identify female candidates for any position, not just prime ministerial position, any position, we will not identify them because they happen to be female, or because they happen to be African Guyanese, or because they happen to be middle class, or because they happen to have sterling records of the civil service. We will identify them because of their worth. And the fact that they're female, the fact that they are African Guyanese, will be secondary to the fact that this is an outstanding candidate. And we are convinced that we have several outstanding candidates. We've lost one of our principal candidates, Ms. Baka. I would never say Ms. Baka was identified as Deputy Speaker of the Parliament because she was a woman or because she happened to be, but Ms. Baka was mixed. Ms. Baka was an excellent candidate, period. Mm-hmm. And that to me is where we need to be going. Now, it's unfortunate that the government chose to say that Ms. Harper has been identified for this criteria, but certainly for the reasons I've just shared with you, I don't think that that advances either the cause of women or the cause of African Guyanese in this multiracial, unified country of ours.
I'm glad to hear that you have such stringent or strict criteria for your selections. I'm so glad to hear that. But one question that comes to mind, and I'm sure somebody is thinking about it, is that now there is a coalition, and I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of the other party, and I really would like to have one member of that party to come on the show and answer this question for themselves. But I'm just hoping that what you just said here is part of or attributes to the whole the coalition and not just the AFC. Anyway, in the chat room, Andrea said, comment, not just a woman, but a black woman. Interesting selection. Nigel, I know we've gone past the time, and this is what happens when you and I get to talk. But any parting message?
Well, I think the parting message would be my tagline, which is better must come. And for better to come, Guyana has to reach the stage where we realize that what exists now cannot continue. And I just ask everybody to ponder upon this. Imagine if the PPPC won this election and you had to live with them for 5 more years. Ask yourself, it's going to be 5 more years of what? They've already demonstrated that they're not interested in being transparent about how they spend taxpayers' money. They spend $4.5 billion. The Chief Justice said it's unconstitutional. They said they don't care. Every possible act of corruption that has been exposed since 2011 will multiply and be magnified. It means that we will be living in a society which is, for all intents and purposes, lawless. And for those people who are not in the inner circle and who are not friends and family of the present regime, my God, their chances of surviving are going to be reduced to almost zero. Whether they're in business and they don't have access to those persons in the government who perceive them as being sympathetic to the government, and so they're targeted for tax assessment. Their goods get 100% in examinations. From that level down to the person who is trying to get a basic job, who can't get that job, or if they get the job, they go on contract, and if the second they seem to be perceived as hostile to the government, they're out in the street. To creating an environment in which all of us have equal opportunity, it is going to become even more acutely skewed. And outside of the friends and family of the present regime, I don't think the chances of success of any of us are significant. And I mean that economically, socially, educationally, well, educationally maybe, but I really, speaking personally, I would have to reassess Guyana.
Thank you for that, Nigel. In the chat room, Andrea said, what was also quite disturbing was her reason for joining, but that's just my opinion. And Brenda Richards said, thank you for your very thorough and insightful answer. Nigel, my brother, once again, thank you for joining us and sharing your views. It's an honor.
Salman, I just want to say to you, you have my deepest gratitude for affording me an opportunity to share with your audience and the diaspora some of my views, some of our views, some of the coalition's views. Because in Guyana, you know, where access to the media is relatively limited, it's sometimes difficult to reach the larger audience. So I thank you for affording me this opportunity.
And before you go, I just saw two messages come in, if I may read them quickly. There is Nicholas McDavid, salute Mr. Hughes. Mr. Hughes, you're part of the bright future of this region. Big up.
I thank him for that.
Thank you, my brother.
And have a good night.
Good night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.